Inya?
Fun. One of the things that I thought was interesting about the question that was asked for the panel is to think about what the nonprofit or NGO community has already done. And my colleague Brian Rahia and I were putting together some thoughts, and we thought, you know, actually there's different models that the NGO world has accomplished. One is gathering and publishing government documents, so the CRS reports, which ridiculously still aren't made available through OpenCRS or Federation of American Scientists, are putting those online. Unifying and preserving disparate government data, like Taxpayers for Common Sense work, and as Bill was talking about, some of the work on subsidies as well, and earmarks, where we wouldn't have to, the rest of us don't have to go through and find all these little pieces of information everywhere. Scavenging for government-related information using sources outside the government, which is something, for example, Center for Responsive Politics does on their revolving door data, as well as what POGO, my organization, does in our federal contractor misconduct database, which is really incredible that the government doesn't actually have a database that tracks its contractors' misconduct yet, although we can talk about that because it's about to, this month, come online. And then finally, auditing and cleaning up the integrity of government data. So those are sort of different pots of types of work that our world has done. But as we were thinking about it, it struck us that there are two big pitfalls as we move forward in assuming that this is sort of the way things should be done. The first is that, for the most part, there's a reliance on the concept of data. And some of the most important work, I think, in holding the government accountable doesn't involve data. It involves information other than data, so reports, memos, emails. And so I just want to highlight that as we continue to go down the road of technology as our friend, there are some things that just require us remembering that some of the most important information isn't going to be found in a data set. But the more exciting part of the conversation to me is then the question of why are the groups doing this work? Why is the government not doing this work? And I think there's a real problem in relying on the rest of us to have to do what the government should be doing. For example, the work that we do on the Federal Contractor Misconduct Database, we can't possibly know all of the instances that are out there. The government does, and so it's inefficient and it's incomplete to rely on the NGO community to be gathering this information. And so we think it's important for the government to embrace its role and responsibility in the way that Rick was just talking about, in helping to make sure the public has faith in what the government's doing. The government's presenting it for the public to see. But that's where I think we have this huge disconnect. As I'm exploring and working on the Open Government Directive and sort of the concept of transparency in the Obama administration, is becoming more and more clear to me that there are two different concepts of what we mean by open government. And I think many of us, maybe all of us in this room, think of open government for the purposes of accountability. And that is not the kind of information that we're going to see entrepreneurs and outside organizations that are creating apps being interested in. And that's the data that I think is incredibly important in making sure that we have that trust in government that Rick was talking about. And so, in addition to it being inefficient relying on the outside sector or groups like us, I think that some of the most important information is going to be lost unless we can, unless the government can embrace the purposes behind why we have open government. So when you look at the language of the Open Government Directive as it was written, it embraced the concept of accountability. Let's see if I can find the specific language. So the reason we're doing this is to increase accountability, promote informed participation by the public, and create economic opportunity. Each agency shall take prompt steps to expand access to information by making it available online in open formats. But there was a fascinating article written by Beth Novak, who had been, until I think earlier this year, maybe last year, working in the White House on the Open Government Directive, where she's really articulating that there is this divide, that the people who had been working on the Open Government Directive weren't thinking about that accountability data really at all. She actually is pretty explicit about it. She says, in retrospect, open government was a bad choice. It's generated too much confusion. many people, even in the White House, still assume that open government means transparency about government. And I read that, I was like, wow, she actually said it. It was a shorthand for open innovation, or the idea that working in a transparent, participatory, and collaborative fashion helps improve performance, inform decision-making, encourage entrepreneurship, and solve problems more effectively. So obviously those are good things, and that's something we want to have. And I guess you were talking, Bill, a little bit about the apps that make life better for people to know where to park. Or I've heard other people who are still working in the White House talk about the purpose of open government is being to help citizens improve their lives. Obviously, that's a really good thing. But that leaves out all that information that those of us who are doing investigations are interested in. That's not going to be on the table. And that's not the kind of information that people in Silicon Valley are going to be embracing. And so I think if anything, so actually she does go specifically to say the aim of open government is to take advantage of the know-how and entrepreneurial spirit of those outside government institutions to work together with those inside government to solve problems. And so this raises, a couple of huge issues for me. One, which is the open government, the direction of the open government, at least those who are applying it, aren't focusing on the kind of open government that we're interested in, that kind of information. And so we need to try to adjust focus or adjust fire on that. And we need to also recognize that in the end, it's always going to be, at least in some ways, our responsibility outside the government to do that piloting. So as I'd mentioned before, POGO had this database that is as good as we can do. We have someone working full-time, scouring U.S. attorneys' databases and media sources to get back to court documents so we can get original source data on any misconduct by any of the government's top contractors. But this month, the Congress created a law that actually requires the government to replicate POGO's database, and it's called FAPIS, another one of these unfortunate acronyms, federal, I don't remember, FAPIIS. But it's going to be very discrete and much smaller than what our database is, because it only includes, I think, admissions of criminal wrongdoing, essentially. So it's not going to be too many in there. And another example is OMB Watch's work on federal spending, which federalspending.org, which became usaspending.gov. And so I think that what would be perfect is if on those accountability fronts, if the NGO world was responsible for doing some of the piloting to get some of the ideas and kinks out, but then the government embraced the fact that it can do it more efficiently, and more importantly, it's the job of the government to inform the public of its operations, and it is a part of why there's open government, not just for the data that is useful for the entrepreneurs in Silicon Valley. So I'll stop on that.
Thank you. Chuck?
Thanks, Jay. Very interesting. Wherever I've dealt with freedom of information in the U.S. or around the world, companies are always more interested in this data than journalists, sadly. It's an embarrassment of my profession to say that, but I think it's true. I don't know. There are experts here who have probably studied this deeply. But my experience has been just as an investigative reporter running the Center for Public Integrity and now the Investigative Reporting Workshop. And I have noticed, having been in DC way back in another century, as my 10-year-old would say, I remember the paper records we used to pour through in the mid-'70s and late '70s. And so I guess we have to acknowledge some modicum of progress. The internet comes to mind and all the other things. The accessibility factor is the fact that you can access a good amount of this from your house and your computer, any part of the world, is not a small point. Before I go deeper. At the center, what we were very proud of, the same way the great graphics expert Edward Tufte doesn't do a single graphic without 4, 5, 6 data sets, points of fact in a single graphic. We prided ourselves in trying to combine data sets. So a story that had one data set about a contribution was, to me, seen as a limited story, frankly. So we tried to do things in a slightly different way. We also wanted to look at it in a macro way sometimes. So we had the earlier panel on the states. We got 7,400 financial disclosure forms for every state lawmaker in America, which did not endear us to the state legislators. And we posted all of those on the web, and then we analyzed the several hundred conflicts of interest, since 41 of the 50 state legislatures are private, doctors on the healthcare committee, insurance executives on that committee, farmers on the ag committee. Yes, they have great expertise, but there's only 7 states with ethics laws. It's a problem. Ethics commissions that never met in 10 years. So that was the first time anyone ever looked at all 50 states at once. And so combining these data sets, we had 45 papers in 45 states that had also never looked at it, apparently, and they did it for their states, but we thought the macro view was useful. 527 records, these are independent expenditure. This is memory lane for Bill and I, having worked together at the center, where a government agency was entrusted with disclosure for this, and they had no idea what they were doing, and no one could read the website. We had a web crawler, and we put up all the 527 independent data, regardless of what your political inclinations are. You could get all that data from this obscure other data. So we were translating, essentially, although it was all technically English. We did 3 Buying of the President books, where we would work on for the books for 1 year to 18 months with dozens of people, and we would basically go through court records, federal records, state records, financial disclosure records, voting pattern records, all expense paid trip records, lobbying records relating maybe to those contributions, and then the top 10 career patrons for their entire life, which most people don't have time to gather that. We're including journalists, I mean, workaday traditional journalists. So that was useful. So, I mean, I think the group, the NGOs, or whatever we are, these so-called private groups, our role is to instigate and encourage and illuminate. Our best moment, I think, was when we filed 73 Freedom of Information Act requests and posted all of the Iraq and Afghanistan war contracts 6 months after the invasion, which no one has ever done in a war, partly because there wasn't an internet back in those other years. And we, those FOIA requests, we appealed one of them, and we got the Halliburton contract declassified and posted all the contracts, and we were the first to disclose Halliburton got by far more than 2 to 1 over any other contractor, the most money for those wars, in those wars. But that's, again, multiple data sets and being willing, in that case, to appeal. I don't think journalists appeal enough. Every time I've appealed, I win. So I want to start appealing more. Anyway, there are a lot of other neat things. I also want to just mention a few groups that I'm just blown away by and always have, besides POGO and Sunlight. I should mention the National Security Archive is just extraordinary to me. I think that they've filed more FOIA requests than any public interest group in America, 40,000 FOIA requests in the last 30 years. They are spectacular in my view. TRAC, Transactional Records Access Clearinghouse, fortunately they have an acronym, TRAC. David Burnham, great journalist, and Susan Long. I think what they do is just amazing. They can take all the federal data and make it understandable for lots of the public and journalists. At the Investigative Reporting Workshop, Professor Wendell Cochran over here, quietly watching the proceedings, had the temerity to get all of the FDIC data for every bank in the United States, 8,000 banks, and compare the end of year 07 with the end of year 08 with a troubled asset ratio analysis for every one of the banks. And we were preparing to put it on the website, and the American Banking Association contacted us and said that there would be a run on the banks. They were deeply, deeply concerned. We asked them to spell their names, and we posted up on the web, and of course we knew there would be no run on the banks. Wendell had done this in a newspaper in small print 20 years earlier. There was no run, so of course there was no run. And there have been, what, 12 million, I always get it wrong, Wendell, 12 million page views, is that right? Something like that, it's great. And we have, now we're looking at broadband access. The broadband companies don't want you to know how much how much penetration or adoption they have in certain areas or certain communities they just haven't gotten to in terms of setting up that broadband. And they don't want you to know how much the cost is and what the speeds are. We just did a partial report. I mean, it was a report showing that the wealthiest suburbs here in DC have the lowest, cheapest rates, and certain other communities in DC and the rural areas around the region have the most expensive, and it's pathetically slow. Stay tuned. We're doing an additional follow-up using 3 federal data sets that'll show that more deeply, and then we hope to do that nationwide, actually, in the next year. But these are things that are intergovernmental. You know, in some cases, we're looking at different types of government agencies at different levels. In other cases, we're using different federal data sets. I mean, I'll spare you because it's late in the afternoon, but when you combine 3 data sets, you get the best of each agency, what they're willing to show you. And if you combine the 3, look out world. It's very exciting. 1 or 2 last points. I just want to mention one of our frustrations, and one of mine, is the increasing ability of private companies, contractors in particular, to block public access to FOIA laws. It is a perversion of the '66 law, in my view. Of course, it reflects what's happened, that 3 out of 4 federal workers today are actually contractors. It's not coincidental that 5 of the 10 richest counties in America happen to be around Washington, D.C. Did I say that? Anyway, and so there's a problem here. So we had a Frontline documentary. We're a Frontline co-production hub, one of the 2 universities in the country doing it at American University. And we were looking at outsourcing maintenance. The airlines they don't put this in their commercials that they're outsourcing the maintenance of their planes to China and Central America. The manuals, by the way, are in English, and the workers don't speak English sometimes. I don't always take a bus, so it's a problem. So anyway, we noticed that United Airlines, we were looking at them, and our FOIA request was blocked because the Department of Defense FOIA officer, they apparently do some carriage of stuff for DOD, blocked it because United didn't want us to see it, and it was all about their safety record regarding maintenance. So we had 80 or 90 pages completely blacked out. But the worst part is we were getting ready to film at their outsourced company, their best friends over in China, doing this for them. Of course, they were notified by United that they had received word from the Department of Defense that this pesky group called the Investigative Reporting Workshop wanted to look at the safety record, and the shoot that we were planning in China the next week was, of course, canceled. So in this instance, the FOIA officer assisted United to block us from telling that story. And it still makes me mad. So anyway, I think there are a lot of limitations here that we all have known about for decades. And I think that it is the job of investigative reporting nonprofits. There are now 50 of these, 50 in the United States. There weren't 50 3 or 4 years ago. That's another conference. But I believe it is the job of outside private groups that have a journalistic bent and backgrounds. In our case, it is our job to push the envelope in every possible way and get as much data as we can, and it is our job to show the public what's really happening, but it's also our job to show the government that we can get the data. When we were going to war in Iraq, and we asked the Defense Advisory Board for the information about the 30 people on that group, including Henry Kissinger, they said it was classified. We cannot have their financial information about their private industry ties. My staff said to me, well, I guess we can't do that. And I said, oh, yes, we are. And we went and we got, I said, all these people, when they get federal contracts, they are excited. They put out press releases. So we'll start gathering commercial data, News, Nexus, Lexus, all that stuff. We'll start gathering all PR, Newswire. Well, sure enough, 1/3 of the people on that thing were that year working for companies getting $80 billion in defense contracts, and they're advising the Secretary of Defense about whether we should go to war. I wonder what they advised. So anyway, so I think even when you can't get the data, you can actually begin to assemble information that is not formally released by the federal government, but incredibly valuable to the public. And I think that's our role too. So basically, it's our role to be a pain in the ass, to be very direct. So I'll yield my time to everybody else.
That would be a great T-shirt.